Hello, my name is Matthew Sortino and welcome to Their Stories Unbroken. Their Stories Unbroken is a podcast that explores how the Holocaust has impacted the lives of Jewish Australians through long-form conversation with survivors of the Shoah and their descendants. In today's episode, I am speaking to Stephen Lindner. Stephen has worked as a lawyer for over 50 years, specialising in criminal defence cases with a particular interest in securing best possible sentencing outcomes for his clients found guilty or pleading guilty. He sees this as being for the benefit not just for those he represents, but for the good of the community they live in. Stephen was one of the first volunteers at Fitzroy Legal Service, a precursor to Victoria Legal Aid. He is a supporter of legal aid for defendants who would otherwise be unrepresented in court. Stephen was also one of a group of lawyers from Australia sent to represent a group of asylum-seekers who were charged with rioting in a detention centre in Nauru. He is also a proud father and his grandfather to two Bialik students, whom he adores. Stephen was born in 1946 in Lodz, Poland, to parents Rafał and Wanda, two Polish Jews who were the only members of their family to survive the Holocaust. In part one of this conversation, we discuss Stephen's early life as a new Australian and how he and his parents navigated starting over in Melbourne. We talk about migration, childhood independence, the impact of World War II on the family and community at large, and the determination of his father to rebuild a legal career despite arriving with no English and no resources. This would not have been possible without the immense effort and sacrifice of Stephen's mother, of course. In part two, Stephen reflects on his long career in criminal defence law. We explore his commitment to social justice, his work with the Fitzroy Legal Service, and the values that inspired him to advocate for the rights of the most vulnerable. In part three, we talk about the legacy of his parents' wartime experience and how these stories were shared within his family. Stephen describes his parents' quiet resilience, their choice to focus on the future rather than the past, and the moments he came to understand the magnitude of what they endured in Poland. It was truly a privilege to speak to Stephen, and I know you will take as much out of this conversation as I did. It brings me great pleasure to now bring you Stephen Lindner. Stephen, welcome.
Hello, good afternoon. Good to be here. Good to have the chance.
Thanks for being here. Stephen, I'd love you to start with your first memory, if you can. What was the first thing that you remember in this world?
My first memory is living in a building of apartments, which was either in Lodz in Poland or in Brussels in Belgium. I must have been 2 or 3, and I remember we lived in a 2 or 3 room apartment. My father conducted his office from there, and I was known for sitting on a potty doing my thing while he was talking to clients. And this story was told to me,
okay.
But I remember it because it happened, and it was a family joke.
Okay, so on that note, where were you born, and what was your history? I guess memorable history before you arrived in Australia.
Okay, I was born in Lodz, Poland, in 1946, May 1946. My parents had settled there after they were rescued a year or two earlier. My father had studied law before the war. He'd graduated in 1938, which was not a great time to start a career as a lawyer. They had settled in Lodz. Around that time, they found, as did other people, that there were still pogroms going on. Despite that the war had finished, there were still problems for Jewish people in Poland, and they decided that it was not the place for them, and they would leave. Many people were then going from Poland to Belgium, which was a bit of a centre for Jewish refugees from Poland. There were Red Cross officers there, and people were using it as a starting off point for going to other places. My parents were applying to various places, I believe, including the United States, where most people seemed to want to go at that time. And they were there in Brussels until 1949, when I was just turning 3 or 4 then. They were accepted to come to Australia. They were sponsored by some lawyers in Melbourne. The main one of those was one called Nathan Jacobson, and also Janover, who there's a connection with this place, this school, because you needed a sponsor before you could come to Australia, and that was part of the reason why it took them 2 or 3 years to actually find a place to go.
Was that unique to Australia, or was that anywhere that you wanted to go?
Or the United States, you needed a sponsor. Yep. Others, I don't know.
Okay.
But they had no family in Australia or anywhere that they knew of. My father had a cousin in London that was not particularly welcoming. That was not a possibility. I'm told they were accepted to Venezuela about the same time as Australia, so I'm glad they made the choice to come to this place. I remember being on a ship. They went by train from Brussels to Genoa in Italy. My memories were on the actual ship. I remember eating spaghetti. It was an Italian ship called the Sorrento, and there were some Jewish, Polish passengers, some known to my parents, but it was mainly, I think, and I know this only from looking at passenger lists. Since then, there were Greeks and Italians also coming to Australia. The ship stopped at Fremantle and eventually landed in Melbourne on the 15th of February 1950. One incident I remember was that they came with a couple of large suitcases. One had bedding in it and another had food, canned food. And when they went through customs and immigration at Port Melbourne, the gentleman behind the counter took their food and threw it in a bin and said, "There's plenty of food in Australia. You don't need to bring it from Europe." And my parents were then taken to a house that was known as Warszawski Dom, which means Warsaw House, which happened to be an old Victorian house in Taronga Road, Hawthorne East.
Oh, wow.
Just up the road from Bialik. The house is still there today, and for a very strange reason that I remember it, that where it was, is that my father used to like walking. He did a lot of walking. And I was only 4 or 5 years old at that time. But we used to walk past a furniture removals place, which is still there, and it's Wilson Removals on the corner of either Malvern Road or High Street. I'm not sure which. And I just remember that, that place that we walked past for no particular reason, but it locates where the house was, because the house is a couple of blocks away. They stayed there until they could work out what they were doing, where they could go. They needed to get jobs because they were virtually penniless. Then they found jobs. My father, within 2 weeks of coming to Australia, went to Melbourne University and asked whether he could enrol because he wanted to still be a lawyer. He hadn't had much of a chance over the previous few years. He had worked as a lawyer in Brussels, helping, again, Polish, Jewish refugees with whatever sort of legal needs they had. But he wanted to practice in Australia. When he went to Melbourne University, he was told, well, you can come along and do some extra subjects because the legal system's different to the European system. But there's just one little catch. You need to learn to speak English. He did go away. My parents both needed to get jobs. They had no money. So my mother got a job sewing in Fitzroy, just off Smith Street. So she went to work. She was very happy doing that. My father got a job at General Motors, building Holdens. Wow. He lasted about a week before they realised that he was either he realised or they realised he was pretty hopeless. And then he had jobs in offices. After a few jobs that he had, he went into business. Firstly, travelling around selling women's clothing to shops, and then set up a small factory with my mother designing women's clothing, and he bought himself a little Ford Prefect motor car. She was designing, organising, sewing, and he was selling. But his dream or his aim was to be a lawyer, to work here as a lawyer.
How amazing is that journey from everything that they've had to deal with to then build it all and start it all fresh. And this is while he's learning English and wanting to go back to Melbourne University.
Well, and that took about 10 years.
Okay, yep.
I remember all that very well because my job in all that enterprise as a primary school student was in evenings and during school holidays, it was my job to fold up blouses and skirts, put them in cellophane bags, so many in each box, to be delivered to a particular shop.
So at this stage, you've started school?
I started school.
And you speak Polish?
Firstly, I started school at about 4 years old because there was not very much in the way of childcare at that time. Both of my parents needed to work, and the best childcare was dropping me off at school, picking me up after school if they could. It didn't take very long before I actually learned that there was a tram stop outside the school. Our home was about 2 miles down the road, about 3 or 4 stops, so I would get on a tram, go to a tram stop opposite the street that my parents lived in. This was in Paran, and walk about 50 metres to our house. My parents would not be home. I would climb through a window, go inside, find some sandwiches that my mother had left for me to have when I came home from school, and then go out and play in the street with other kids for a couple of hours before my parents came home. And that was the pattern in grades 1, 2 and 3, which I managed to complete in about a year. And to answer your question, I learned English very quickly. I learnt to read very quickly. I would speak to my parents in English. They would speak to me in Polish. So I understood Polish, and I still understand it very well. It's challenging for me to try to put a sentence together. I can't say I speak Polish, but I understand Polish.
What was Melbourne like at that stage, and who were your neighbours? Who were you talking to? Who was the friends you would hang out with?
Well, that's interesting. The neighbours, I remember one neighbour was a driver of a van for the Herald and Weekly Times, and I remember that very well because they lived in the house opposite. He had a child that and I don't even remember now whether it was a boy or a girl, but we were good friends. And they took me in this van to a staff picnic at Christmas time. That stands out in my memory. There was also a fellow, a couple of houses up that my father made friends with, called Barry Hepworth. He was a law student at that time, and my father's ears pricked up when he found that out, and they became very good friends. And they were friends, lifelong friends, in fact. We had a next-door neighbour called Nancy Pretty. So I got to know neighbours and I got to know other kids. Now I don't remember their names, I don't remember anything about them, but it was a classic sort of 1950s kids playing in the street. And they'd all come to our backyard sometimes. They'd kick a football up and down the street. I don't remember particular games, but we would just be around the street until the parents came home, and then they'd prepared dinner and didn't watch TV. There was no TV.
So with friends, you're coming from another country, another part of the world. This is a time before the internet, before television.
Yeah.
So were all these neighbours and people around you curious, and were you ever discriminated against in the early days or thought about as different, or were you just one of the new kids on the block?
It's interesting you ask that because it's never occurred to me. It's never occurred to me either in a negative way or positive way. I mean, if I was being discriminated against, I probably wouldn't know it. There probably were people that didn't particularly like these newcomers. I think they were called newcomers or new Australians in those days. But then I suppose they would have ignored us. But there were quite a few kids on the street of different ages, and we'd just play. And I suppose kids at that sort of age, primary school age, just play with each other. They don't think about religion, background, even language. I mean, I don't remember having any difficulty communicating at that time at all.
Yeah, that's amazing that kids, and in that time people look back and say, oh, Australia's a racist country or whatever it might be. But my family's got a similar story from being from Italy, arriving. My father arrived in 1967 when he was 7 years old, and my mother was born here, but her parents had just arrived to Australia from Italy as well. And yeah, it just seems like there was obviously things that might have happened along the way, but people just get together from all around the world, Irish, Dutch, German, Italian, whatever, and together you are.
And if there was anything negative, I just didn't know. I didn't wear a kippah, and my father didn't have any obvious differences. We weren't religious at all. My parents got to know neighbours as well. Yeah. It wasn't just me. And we were only there for 2.5 years. Then we moved to Elwood, and I started at Elwood Central School. There was a large Jewish population there. Yep. There were a lot of kids in similar situations to me, and my parents had friends who also had children at the same school. But even so, history didn't impinge on anything we did. It was just school. I had friends, Jewish friends, non-Jewish friends. You just sat in class, you did your things, you went outside, you kicked a football or you played cricket.
Yeah.
Summer or winter or summer.
Was being Jewish something that was talked about, spoken about, like traditions, or was it, but you're now Australian, we just didn't talk about that? Was Polish, being considered Polish something, or was that almost after the pogroms, after the war, was that something that was almost too much to bear to speak about being Polish, other than the idea of speaking Polish? But was that nationalistic identity to where? Was it Poland? Was it to the newfound Israel? Was it being Jewish? Was it just Australia? Or was it just something you didn't remember as a kid?
My parents, as far as I know, never denied being Jewish. They were Jewish. They didn't attend a synagogue, except my mother went once a year on Yom Kippur. My father, it just wasn't a topic in our household of interest. What did happen that I remember that stood out was that all their friends were Jewish because they were the people they knew from Poland or who'd been introduced as family, extended family of those people. But at school, I started at Elwood Central School in grade 3, and in grade 4, I remember that they had a period once a week called religious instructions. And some people would go along to religious instruction, which was a Christian group, and I didn't know of them as Christian. And there was another group that went to the Jewish religious instruction. And there were a few kids who went to the library and they didn't go to any of that. I went as just from habit and following friends that I was sitting with in class, I went to the Christian one. So what I'm saying is that I really didn't know I was Jewish until 4th grade, which would have been 19 54, that sort of time. I was always the youngest in my class. So I just went along and I learnt about Jesus and all that. There was a religious instructor who came. I remember there was a board where he stuck pictures of camels and things and people crossing the desert. And my father came along to the school one day and he said, "You shouldn't be going there." And he spoke to the teachers, the headmaster or whoever, and he said, "My son is not Christian, he's Jewish, but I don't want him to go to Jewish religious instruction. He can go to the library." Okay. So I had permission to go to the library. And I remember it was one of the few times my father actually came to the school. So he felt strongly enough about it that he didn't want me to go to that group, but he didn't particularly need me to go to the Jewish group either. Yeah. He said I can go to the library and read books.
Yep.
So that was the incident that I remember about being Jewish. But what I did do is that I went to the library a few times and then I did go to the Jewish religious instruction because I had friends who were going there.
Yep.
So my motivation was to follow friends here and follow friends there. And it was a bit lonely in the library. So I went to Jewish religious instruction. And there was someone that came there from, I think it was the Elwood Shul in Dickens Street, once a week, who gave a talk. And that was about the extent of my involvement with the Jewish religion at that time.
So you mentioned that you skipped a few classes. So in 1, 2, 3, and you were young. So was that because of just ability?
I remember when I went to Paran State School, I sort of remember being in grade 1, then grade 2, then grade 3. Then I went to Elwood Central School, and Elwood Central School had 2 sections. One was a small school which went from prep to grade 3, and there was another school across the road which went from included some grade 3, but it went from grade 4 to year 7 or year 8. I remember my parents taking me along to the small school because our neighbours had a child there and I went there and they must have given me some sort of test and they found that I could read. I could read quite well. So I was trundled across the road to the big school.
Wow.
And the only assessment was my reading ability.
Okay.
So at about 7 or 8 years old, I was in grade 4, I think, and I could read. And then from then on, I was always the youngest in the class. Yeah.
So reading was fine, but maths struggled.
Maths was not, exactly. That's exactly it. And in those days, eventually, you either did law or medicine, and I was pretty hopeless at maths. So
the law path. And your father obviously was a lawyer originally in Poland and then had this business. Did he speak? He had this friend that was at law school as well. Did he often talk about law and want you to follow in his footsteps in that way, or did you just hear him talking about it that made you want to do this, or was it just, as you said, there were 2 pathways you took?
Well, it happened partly because there was not as much choice as you have these days, and partly it's sort of I was imbued in it because when I was in high school, my father decided that his language was good enough and he started studying, enrolled and started at Melbourne Uni after he'd been working he'd had the business for about, 6, 8, 10 years. But we lived in Elwood, very close to Elwood Beach. He liked walking, and the method of studying that he knew was learning things by rote. That was how he'd always learnt things. And he'd picked up enough English to be able to do that. He would walk with me, and by this time I was a teenager. He'd write essays, and he'd walk, and I would have the essay in my hand, and he'd be saying it in English, of course. So I actually learnt a fair bit of British history and basic law subjects, because he only had to do. He started studying part-time, and that didn't work. He failed the subject, so he gave up the business. My mother went to work in an office, and he studied full-time. So I'd spent a fair bit of time walking, and particularly at Elwood Beach, I remember walking up and down the path there. He'd be reciting all this stuff, and I'd have the notes, and I'd help him along if he was missing a beat. So I was learning about law well before I ever went to university. So I suppose it sort of was a natural progression, and I passed well enough to get in.
What was your relationship with your parents like before adulthood?
The relationship was, in a way, not all that different to what it was as I described it when I first started school, and that was that they were very involved in work and business, and I sort of had my own friends at school. I'd still come home and they wouldn't be there, and I'd either do what I needed to do at home, homework or whatever, or I'd meet up with friends and come home when they came home. In a way, there wasn't a lot of sort of mentoring and doing things together. We'd do things on the weekend. We'd go away and meet with family, friends, and that sort of thing. But I really don't remember close discussions, advice, that sort of thing with my parents. I feel as though I grew up quite independently.
Which probably was normal for that time.
They might have seen it very differently. I don't know. But my father, as I told you, he didn't go to the shul. I had friends who were in the Scouts, which was just a couple of blocks from where we lived. So my father took me along there. I remember that. And he was pretty pleased that I was involved in that organisation. And I spent a few years with that. My relationship with my parents, now that I think about it, I was very happy with one aspect of Scouts, and that was going away camping and hiking, holidays and on weekends. So I'd be away from home. I have a brother who was born in 1956 in Melbourne. So he's 10 years younger than me.
Yep.
So we're sort of different generations, but he ended up doing law as well. We got to work together for a while, and we both followed the same sort of kind of law. We were both in the criminal law defence area.
Is that what your dad was interested in?
No. He was interested in something very different. He had a very good business head. I don't know what he did in Poland. I don't think he ever really got to practice law because he finished in 1938. And then I don't know what he spent his time doing in 1939, but after that,
September,
in the ghetto,
it was war.
September 39. One thing he did was that he helped his father in his business. His father had a shop on a street called Nalewki, which was a street which had quite a lot of Jewish businesses. My mother's family also had a shop there. But his father had a shop selling musical instruments. It was the beginning of gramophones. And he imported something, a gramophone which he labelled as a solophone because his name was Solomon. And my father was very proud of the fact that he introduced a new accounting system to his father's business. So he was helping his father in his business. As for law, he developed very quickly a conveyancing practice. He'd act for people purchasing properties. And he was very good with language. So he set up offices in places where there were estate agents. So an estate agent would have a room, he'd rent a room, he'd be the go-to solicitor. If someone was purchasing a property, the agent would say, I've got a lawyer right here for you. He probably invented cut-price conveyancing when it was actually illegal to not charge
a going rate.
The set rate.
Okay.
He got himself into trouble for that. But So, and there were migrants coming, there were Yugoslav migrants, there were Greek and Italian migrants. He would have an office in Fitzroy, he'd have an office in Footscray, he'd have an office in Carlton. Wherever there was a business, he would have an office. And then he had another thing going, and this was with involved Jewish clients, where he would put he'd put 2 advertisements in the paper. He'd put one advertisement to say that he had clients with mortgage money available who wanted to lend money, and he'd put another advertisement inviting clients who wanted to borrow money. And he would put them together and charge a fee and do the conveyancing. And he got to know quite a few of the sort of well-known people in finance, property and business. So he built up his business fairly quickly that way.
Listening to this and today in the modern world, it almost seems like if there's any lingering trauma or a background of something that had gone wrong, it would be at the forefront of people's identity in some ways. Yeah. But from many stories I've heard and from the stories of the story of your parents and your life growing up, was their experience in the Holocaust in Europe during World War II as Jews in Poland, in Warsaw, was that something that you ever spoke to your parents about directly? And also, what was the first time, or when was the first time that you realised what had happened to your parents?
The first I realised anything about the war and trauma was when my parents, when we were living in Elwood, so by this time I was into primary school, and they had friends who had also come from, all their friends, most of their friends were Polish Jews. They'd talk about people who were suffering psychiatric issues, people who had split up, families who'd split up. A particular instance that I remember was that after a separation, a woman stuck her head in an oven and gassed herself.
Wow. Yep.
Something like that sticks in your mind.
Yeah. And you were young when you heard that.
I was young.
Yeah.
I was probably 8 or 10, that sort of age. And my parents talked about it, and they talked with their friends about it. She had a history in the ghetto. She'd lost her family, all that sort of thing. So all their friends had histories that came from that time, and I would overhear them talking about other people's issues. As for my parents, what I see looking back, and I didn't think about it at the time, but they were very stoic. They would look at tomorrow rather than yesterday. Their attitude was one of get on with it.
Yeah.
At the same time, I know my mother was seeing doctors. I didn't know what she was seeing doctors about, and she'd take tablets. At one stage, they were making, when my father was still alive, working as a lawyer, he was making applications to the restitution fund. There was a fund that was established in Germany and also Americans to pay compensation or give medical support and help to survivors of the war.
Is that throughout the world that they were given money?
I think they were throughout the world.
Okay.
But that took a number of years, and I remember my father was initially applying on behalf of my mother for help from them, but then I remember he applied as well, and there were a few doctors who they knew that they could go to for help supporting these applications. And my father applied over a number of years, and because he was knocked back, because the response was, why do you need help? Why do you need compensation? Here you are, you're a lawyer, you've studied law, you ran a business, you've studied law again in Australia. You can't possibly have psychiatric issues, which was the sort of basis of most of these applications. And eventually I think he got something not very much, and probably not all that long before he died.
Okay.
So I remember that the war was discussed in that sort of context, not with me, but I'd hear about it in the background.
Yep.
My father talking to other people about it. And he acted for other people who were making these applications as well.
Yep. And was it referred to as like the war, the goings on of the war, or was it the Holocaust, the Shoah,
No. It was referred as, they talked about the old days. Before we came here, my mother talked about how she went skiing at a town called Zakopane, a holiday resort. But they talk about it as a bit of history rather than using the kind of terms that we use these days to define what was happening. It was just part of their lives. Like, we'd talk about, last year we went to Alice Springs.
Yep. And that allowed tomorrow to come and exist. It was like, okay, we talk about the things we have in common with our friends and similar experiences, but then we move to how's the business going? How can we live this new life in Australia? What opportunities we have and go from there.
And there are things to be done tomorrow. Yeah, my parents were more interested in sort of getting on with it rather than talking about the past.
Yep.
And it's sort of all part of the same thing that I lived quite an independent life. I lived with my parents. I didn't live away from home ever until I was married. But, they had their friends. I'd go out with people I was friends with.
Yep.
The war or even their family life at home just wasn't a subject. And that's why it was great that Adele was able to get much more detail than I ever did. I mean, I knew that, my parents had sisters. I knew their names. My parents are the only survivors of each of their families.
I want to hear all about what you know about your parents' story, but before we get there, you're now, in our story, your dad's working, doing the conveyancing and his other businesses. And have you, at this point, decided that definitely law's your pathway and you're on the way to doing that?
Yeah, well, that was the pathway that I took at school. I took the sort of humanities subjects.
Yep.
I started school young. I finished at the age of 16. My results were good, but they weren't good enough to get into uni. Okay. If I was Einstein, if I was incredibly brilliant, I would have got in at 16, but I didn't get in. So I had what they call these days a gap year, where I worked, I went away a bit, I did a couple more subjects, and then I got into uni the next year.
So where did you work in that year?
I had a few different jobs. I had office jobs. I actually knew people at uni, and there was a work department. Students could get jobs, and people who needed students to do jobs would do it through this office at the uni. I worked in offices. I worked as an assistant, a labourer on housing commission flats, those monstrosities, the 20,
Was
30.
that Paran that you?
No, in Flemington.
Oh, Flemington.
Where the freeway starts, there's those yellow things.
There was a lot of issues during COVID.
I built those.
Oh, wow. You were there.
I'm not that proud, but
wow.
Yeah,
yep.
So I just did very basic carrying things and driving a little truck around. I was interested in surfing. I liked doing that. I went to Torquay with friends and we'd camp down there. So I'd sort of spend the summer down there. And the year went very quickly. So I went to uni the following year.
So I'd love to unpack some of your career now. Where did it all begin for you in the legal defence and criminal area?
I did articles. Articles is like an apprenticeship. When you finish your studies, you have to do 1 year before you can be practicing as a lawyer independently. So I did articles with a fairly average sort of firm in the city. I worked with my father for not very long, I don't think either of us was terribly comfortable with me being there. My father was in the office. My mother worked there. She helped him. She'd do sort of work outside the office and in the office for him, and he had a secretary. And I wasn't particularly interested in the sort of work he was doing. So I looked around and I got a job with a firm where they did some criminal law. But at the same time, or very soon after, there was a change of government. It was Whitlam, Jim Cairns, people like that, and they set up the Australian Legal Aid Office. I'd been overseas. I went overseas for a couple of years, and I was travelling around and working overseas, in odd jobs. But when I came back in November 1972, it was the start of the new government, and I also had friends who were setting up the Fitzroy Legal Service, which was the first one of its kind, certainly in Victoria, maybe in Australia, which was free legal advice. So I got very involved in that. And then I got a job with an office that was set up by this new government, the Australian Legal Aid Office, and they did exclusively crime, and this time it wasn't a voluntary work, it was a job.
Yeah.
So I got paid for doing what I had been doing voluntarily. So I worked with the Australian Legal Aid Office for about 3 years, and then I joined a couple of friends who I'd had from university in an office in Carlton. They had already established a criminal practice where they were being referred work from other lawyers who didn't want to touch that sort of thing because there were only a couple of firms in Melbourne that did crime. There were health services, support services who would refer people, and we built up very quickly a pretty solid sort of criminal practice. Our office was in Lygon Street, Carlton, so it was easy to get to. There were a lot of people. It was the beginning of police being quite active in charging people with drug offences, and so the drug treatment centres would also be referring people to us. Some police would even refer people to us because they knew that we were doing it.
Yep.
So that went for quite a few years until I decided that since I was going to court during the day and preparing things in the morning before I'd go to court and then seeing clients after I'd come back from court, the days tended to become very, very long. Sometimes I'd stay in the office overnight. And I decided that what I really wanted to do was just do the court appearances.
Okay.
So I left the solicitor's office and I joined the bar. So I became a barrister. This is in 1989, 90. My brother, who's 10 years younger than me, had also studied law. He had already joined the bar as a barrister, and we were referring work to him. So he built up a criminal practice before I even did at the bar. And so now I've been a barrister for about 40 years, and I'm no longer continuing my registration. So my brother's already retired, and I'm retiring this year.
Oh, this year.
So that's
special time for the podcast.
It. So and I practiced at the bar exclusively as a barrister, mainly in the county court, some magistrates' court, some Supreme Court.
What inspired you to go down that path and volunteer and then work for maybe even less money and more time than you could have elsewhere potentially? Was it the 60s and did some of the civil rights movement and Vietnam and all of that was influential to you and in your travel as well?
Yeah, well, it was the time of Vietnam. It was the time of protest marches that I was involved in. And you've reminded me that when I was still with my father, I turned, was it 18 or 20 when you could be drafted? And I learned a lot because I was used to studying. If I needed to follow a project, I'd study. I learned a lot about being a conscientious objector. And it was my aim, I don't know if you know about how the draft worked but
Your
they
birthday?
pulled a marble out. If it had your birthday on it, you were in. I managed to miss out on that. They didn't pull my birthday out. But since I'd learned all this stuff about conscientious objectors, the way that whole system worked, just by chance, my father had a client, a woman who had lost her entire family in the war. She had a son who was called up, and she was desperate. She said, I can't let him go to war after all of what's happened in my family. He's my only son. But she came to us really just saying, you have to help me, you have to help me. I took the instructions, I got the whole story, and I thought that we might follow the conscientious objector route. But the other thing was that you could apply you had to go to court, to a magistrate's court, if you had a reason of religious or other reasonable grounds for not going into the army, avoid being conscripted. And we had this whole family story, and it mainly came from the mother. The son didn't have much to say at all, but she was just desperate. She said, you have to help me.
Understandably, yeah.
So I prepared a case. We had a couple of doctors, a psychiatrist and a GP who was her GP and who talked more about the effect on her than on him, but on the family as a whole, the family of two people. We engaged the leading barrister in Melbourne, leading criminal barrister who happened to be Jewish, a man by the name of Morris Ashkenazi QC. He was a sort of leading light in the community at that time. He appeared pro bono for nothing. He appeared before the magistrate. I was in court, and I think he almost had, or maybe he did have the magistrate in tears, but it was very much an emotional thing rather than legal. But he satisfied the magistrate that this fellow should not be drafted.
Wow.
And it was the first case where there was a reason other than a religious reason, because there were conscientious objectors on the basis of being exclusive brethren, or, there are religions, Mormons, who object to going to war. They were avoiding being drafted. But this was the first one where it was really on the
history,
edges
not
of that.
religion as such, but history.
But it involved the religion.
Yes.
It had to involve the religion to come within the legislation. So that was an important victory as it happened.
Yeah, and that would have inspired you.
And that was right at the beginning of my career.
Wow. What are the 2 or 3 things that you are most proud of in your career?
There was one particular set of circumstances where my brother, and about 10 other lawyers went from Melbourne to Nauru. Government policy at that time in 2014 was that a lot of refugees were coming to Australia by boats from Indonesia, and they were being picked up at Christmas Island and along the coast, and they were coming from Palestine, of all places, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Cambodia, Vietnam, getting onto fishing boats in Indonesia and coming to Australia. The government policy was that none of those people would ever succeed in remaining in Australia.
That was the Tony Abbott policy?
That's right.
Because Howard had the children overboard and things were going on back then.
It was around 2014.
Yeah, so that was Abbott for sure,
And anyone who was being picked up off these boats were being sent either to Manus Island, New Guinea, or to Nauru. On Nauru, there was a large number of people. There were young men in one area and there were families in another area. They were kept completely separate. The men were in detention. They had fences around them with barbed wire on top and armed guards. So they couldn't leave. They didn't have the freedom of the island, even though it was an island that they couldn't go anywhere from. Nauru, and it's a separate republic. It's a republic that was doing very poorly economically, so the government paid them large amounts of money to set up these detention camps. Unsurprisingly, a lot of them were very frustrated with being kept in these fenced areas, and the government was claiming that they were processing them to find whether there were any who could come to Australia, but they were all, the few that were being processed were being knocked back, and others, they were trying to encourage them to go back to where they'd come from, and they were offering them sometimes $10,000 to go back, but they were saying, if we go back, we'll die.
Yeah.
And they were getting very, very frustrated because they were really just being ignored. They were being fed, and that was about it. So there was a riot. The government claimed there was $65 million worth of damage, so it was a serious riot. I'm sure it didn't come to anything like that amount of money, but that's what they were being quoted to repair it. 150 of the refugees were charged with offences ranging from riot, which was a serious offence, down to malicious damage and all sorts of other things. Because they were charged with criminal offences, they had to be put before a court. The court was a room about the size of this room. And
so pretty small. In Nauru?
In Nauru,
yep.
Yeah, in Nauru. There was a court about a room where there would be a judge, a couple of lawyers maybe, and someone else, but they weren't used to. They certainly didn't have room for 150 people to defend cases. They just didn't have provisions for it. So the Australian government, in its wisdom, paid for a number of prosecutors, a number of defence lawyers, and a barrister from Melbourne who acted as a judge. They created a court in what was in fact the ballroom of the only hotel.
Wow.
There was a hotel because they'd been trying to attract tourists before all this came about. They didn't have many tourists, but they had a large hotel, and they built a courtroom in there. The 150 was eventually reduced to about 50. There were about 8 defence barristers and some, as I said, prosecutors and a judge. We were all housed in this hotel, in the guest rooms. We ate in the dining hall. There was a bar.
Wow.
It was a proper hotel, and there was a court conducted as part of the in part of the hotel. And we were there for about 3 months, to cut a long story short. Eventually, we negotiated. I was one of the defence barristers. My brother was another one. We each had a few clients. We negotiated with the prosecutor. We were there for months. The case was partly heard. We were defending it and defending it and defending it. Eventually, I don't know if you've been involved in criminal proceedings, but it's like any business. There's negotiation. People start from...
from all the movies
like
and films.
Unions. Unionists start, they say we want $500 an hour. Business operators offer $10 an hour, and it ends up something in between. It's the same with criminal charges. Police charge people with a number of charges, and they can end up with some that people plead guilty to, and that frees up the court system so that you don't have everyone defending all charges. It comes down to sentencing. The judge decides what the penalty is going to be. In this case, they were given a community corrections order, which didn't exist at that time there, but we had them here, so it was imported to there. Within 6 months, they had to do some work. They built a couple of houses, and that was it. So it was an interesting case. It was an interesting situation, a unique situation. Some of the refugees ended up staying there. Some went to other places. Some went to New Zealand. I had one particular client who I remembered was a Palestinian. He was a journalist. His family house was in Gaza, on the edge, on the border. He objected to the Hamas or someone else wanted to use his house to shoot rockets.
Okay.
He and his family objected. He was a journalist. He published some articles that the authorities there in Palestine didn't particularly like. He was told by people that his life was in danger if he went on with this, and he decided it was a good time to leave. So he was one of these refugees from all these different countries who happened to be my client. And ironically, despite what the government had said, he did end up coming to Australia because there were aid agencies working there, and one of the women in the agency fell in love. They got married. She brought him to Australia as her husband.
I now want to move on to your parents' story. And I know that you're involved in some volunteer work at the Holocaust Museum in Melbourne now. And you've also mentioned Courage to Care and going out to some schools in a volunteer capacity. Is the story of your parents the one that you share in that capacity?
Yes. When I do the Courage to Care visits to schools, 2 people go into a classroom of, say, 25 students. One is called a facilitator. The other one's called either a speaker or a custodian. Custodian probably describes it better because it's a custodian of a story. Ideally, the speaker is a person who has survived the Holocaust. The purpose of the Courage to Care program is not to tell the story of the Holocaust or to recite history. It's to provide an example of a person or people who have been an upstander rather than a bystander. That's what they're trying to teach kids in terms of respect, calling out bullying, supporting people who are being attacked either physically or verbally, not necessarily to put these students that we talk to in danger, but allowing them to think about being an upstander rather than a bystander, and either, say, reporting problems that are happening, or if it's milder, to go up to someone and say, "Can I help you? Are you okay?" Or going up to another person saying, "It's not right for you to be doing that." But the stories that people who are involved with Courage to Care tell are much more serious examples of people being upstanders. And my parents' example, for a reasonably brief version, it goes like this, that my parents both lived in Warsaw, in Poland. They'd lived there all their lives. Their parents had either lived there, or I think one out of their grandparents had come from Russia. But Warsaw was their home. Each of their parents owned a shop in a street where many of the shops were run by Jewish people. Each of their families lived on streets parallel and close to one another in the same area. Probably Jewish families were even much more concentrated than, say, Caulfield, East St Kilda. It was a Jewish area which became, after 1939-40, became the Warsaw Ghetto. So my parents were not herded into the Warsaw Ghetto, as were people from many other towns and cities. They were there. Warsaw Ghetto grew up around them. The walls were built around them. It was there that they met. They went out together for some time. I don't know how long. But in the end they were, or not in the end, but they were actually married in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942 when they were both 27 years old.
Oh, that's an amazing aspect of it, Stephen, that there's this idea of living life even in the worst of, or close to the worst of conditions, knowing that something's wrong around them, what's happening in Poland with the Nazi invasion, to have this thought of resistance, do you think, or was it just getting on with it?
Well, in the end, it was getting on with it and living day to day. And the Nazi invasion was, from their point of view, very much just an extension of life as it had been for a number of years earlier. Because before the Nazi invasion, there was discrimination against Jews generally in Poland. There were either rules or practices as to where they could work, live, go to school, shop. And the one example of that was my father was very keen to study law, and he applied to the Warsaw University. This would be around 1934, 35, around that time. He was refused because of their numerus clausa, which was a quota system whereby no more than 10% of their students were allowed to be Jewish, or no more than 10% of Jewish people were allowed to be students. He then went off to another university in Vilnius University, and studied there for a year, and applied again to the Warsaw University, and this time he was accepted. He was accepted as a student. However, he was identified as a Jew, as a Jewish student. I've actually been to Poland with my brother, Benjamin, and my daughter, Adele. We went along to the university, and they had all my father's records, including a document that was known as a passport, which was basically an academic record from the first day he started at the university till the last day. The first page has a photograph, name, date of birth, and there are a few stamps. Each page after that is a record of how they went in each subject, which I assume was filled in by the teacher or lecturer. So that would then be filled up by the time they finished their studies, and they'd return this booklet to the university, which was very handy for us because it was their part of his record. He didn't get to keep it. We went to the university. We asked for his records. They were very obliging. In fact, they were particularly good. They said, come back tomorrow and we'll give you a folder and you can go into a room and look at it. You can't take it away, but you can look at it. And we did look at it. And certainly the aim in my mind was not to see how he went in his whatever subjects he did, but what I was looking for was evidence of this story that we'd heard about Jews being identified and the quota. And we were looking for something like a stamp of a big capital J in this document, and there was no such stamp. However, there was a stamp, a purple stamp near his name. The first word on the top was miejsce, which means places. And under that, my Polish is not good. I thought it read to sit on the left side of the room, and I've been told since that it says to sit in the odd-numbered seats in the room, and I've heard other people say that it means sit at the back of the room. In any case, whichever one of those it is, what it was to separate the Jewish students from others, and this was the way they were identified, not with a big J, but slightly subtly, that they were to sit separately. And only Jewish students had that stamp. I believe, as a protest, a number of those students refused to sit in those seats and instead stood up for the lecture against the walls at the side of the classroom or lecture theatre. The purpose for that part of the story, when I tell it at Courage to Care, is that these appear to be upstanders. There were non-Jewish students who joined them, standing by the side of the classroom, which indicated that to the Jewish students that they had some support. I think they'd probably be called upstanders today.
So your parents had gotten married within the ghetto?
Okay, yes, that's where another part of the story moves on, and that is that they were married in May 1942 inside the ghetto. They had their families with them. It was a moment of joy in their life, because by 1942 things were becoming particularly bad in the ghetto. They had their families with them. I assume, and I haven't been told a lot of detail, but there were, my guess is, the usual kind of celebrations. What I have been told is that their entire families were with them. My father had 2 sisters, my mother had 3 sisters. They had cousins, grandparents. Within a very short time after that, there were waves of attacks by Nazi military. One aspect that I remember from my mother is that she didn't tell us very much, but one thing she told us was that you think the Nazis were bad. They employed Ukrainians who were animals, and they were much worse than the Nazis. In any case, they were systematically going through buildings. Everyone there lived in apartments. They didn't live in houses as they do here on separate blocks. They lived in apartments, 2, 3, 4 stories high, with staircases, and that's significant. In the particular apartments that our families lived in, which were only a block apart, there were no lifts, there were staircases. The invaders would go through, apart from, one thing they'd do was to steal everything of value, jewellery, paintings, furniture, anything they could lay their hands on. And the other thing they would do was to round up people and shouted as they went up the stairs, waving their guns, their rifles. They'd be shouting, "Juden raus," Jews out. They rounded people up, they herded them down to the street. What we've been told by our parents is that all of their parents and families were amongst those people who were forced out into the street. My father and mother, Rafa and Wanda, avoided that same fate by hiding under some stairs. So there was a staircase. People were running up and down the stairs. There was a lot of noise going on. 2 people were squeezed somehow under the staircase, keeping perfectly silent, of course. And people who were then taken out of the buildings, out of the apartments into the street, were either shot on the spot or sent off to transit camps, work camps, death camps. My parents heard gunshots. They had a pretty good idea of what was happening out there, and the simple story is that they never saw any of their families again. And I don't know whether both of their families were together in these buildings, because people were forced to live together with 8, 9, 10 people to a room. But I don't know, and I don't think we'll ever know whether that scenario happened with both of their families together or the 2 families separately. But the ultimate result was that out of those 2 entire families, 2 people survived, and that was my father and my mother.
When you first heard that story, was that through the Roots project that Adele did?
Yes.
And
yeah.
Do you remember the way that story was told to her? Or
no, because my mother and Adele would just disappear to another room and they'd talk. I hadn't heard that story in its entirety. What I had heard is that they were hidden. I had heard that phrase, Juden raus. I had heard about it being very noisy and active and busy, and people never being seen again. The details, I think, were more as between my mother and Adele. The next phase of what happened to them was that the Warsaw Ghetto was basically being emptied out as much as it could be. The population had, before the war, been about 350,000. The figures that we read and hear about are that the population increased by about 150,000 at its at its top, but we don't know the exact statistics, because at the same time as people were being brought in from other towns and cities, they were being sent out the other end to the camps. And we've tried to follow up names through all the internet records, and nothing's come up for any of those close families. Distant, extended families have communicated mainly with Adele over the internet, but none of the close families. The next thing that happened, so far as my parents were concerned, was that they had jobs. They got jobs in the Warsaw Ghetto. So they were never transported in those cattle trucks that we see and hear, or hear and see pictures about. They never went to any of the camps, any of the concentration camps. They were, in their sort of mid to late 20s. They were reasonably healthy, and they were alive, and they were useful. So they both had jobs in a factory run by a gentleman by the name of Schultz. Their job was to sit behind a sewing machine and sew uniforms for the Nazis. It was essentially slave labour. They weren't paid. It wasn't a 9-to-5 job. They were paid one meal a day. They were to sleep in areas or rooms in the same buildings as where they worked, and they were very grateful for that. They were slave labour, but they were alive. So as far as they were concerned, Schultz was, in a weird sort of way, an upstander rather than a bystander. He was a businessman in it for the money, but he saved their lives by giving them jobs. That's what they did. That's what got them by in the Warsaw Ghetto until April 1943, around about the 19th of April, to be specific, was the time of the resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto. It was the time of the final solution, and the aim of the Nazis was to both wipe out the Jewish population of Warsaw and destroy all the buildings. And that's what they went about doing systematically. The few people that were left had a choice, either to stay, and that was a hopeless situation, and we read about it in quite a few books like Miller 18. They'd either stay with a sort of hopeless defence. They had a few firearms, a few guns that a lot of them were smuggled in by teenagers and children who could squeeze through sewers and gaps in the wall, but it was nothing compared to what the Nazis had. The choice that each of those people in the Warsaw Ghetto had was either a futile defence or to try to escape. My parents, they decided they'd try to escape. My mother had some jewellery, I believe, either some jewellery or a fur coat. And there are two different versions I've heard, but it doesn't matter. It's not relevant. But the point is that they went to one of the exits from the ghetto, which was next to a railway line, next to a railway station. They gave, whether it was a fur coat or jewellery, doesn't particularly matter, but they gave something to a guard. He turned the other way and through they went. Maybe he was an upstander. Would he have turned the other way and let them through if they hadn't bribed him? We'll never know. Would he have put them in anyway, even though they gave him a bribe? And that would have been the end for them. They knew the geography of the place, so they knew where the right railway station was. They knew where they were headed. They boarded a train, which was fairly dangerous in itself because of their fellow passengers. And one thing that I recall very well that my mother saying, even before Adele was getting her story, is that when they were on this train heading out of Warsaw to a holiday resort, when they were on this train, there were Poles, what she calls Poles, but they're non-Jewish Poles, were pointing out the window at the ghetto burning and laughing. That's what she remembered.
Yeah, one thing that needs to be sort of understood, especially by those that maybe have only a fleeting understanding of Europe at that time, was that anti-Semitism was rampant and possible, not just because of the Nazi invasions, as you said earlier, but because of the population's willingness to accept it in many cases. Yeah. You obviously had the upstanders that you've mentioned, but you also had many bystanders and active participants too.
There were bystanders who did absolutely nothing, and there were bystanders that enjoyed what was happening, what I just said. They were looking out the window and laughing as they said the ghetto was burning. They were going off to a holiday resort. There was a town or a village called Śródborów, just out of Warsaw. The family was not wealthy, but they were reasonably well off. They owned businesses, they owned shops, or the extended family, and they also owned a small block of 4 holiday flats. And as well, on the same piece of land, there was a caretaker's cottage. There was a husband and wife who were not Jewish, so Polish Catholics, and they had 5 young daughters, and they all lived in a little house, the caretaker's house, and their job, they were there to look after the place. And when members of the family, of our family, were not using the flats, they could be rented out like Airbnb. And part of their job was to collect the rent, look after the tenants, clean up before and after when people were coming there. The caretaker family was a lady by the name of Helena and her husband by the name of Alexander, and as I said, 5 young daughters. And that's where my parents were headed. They weren't going there for a holiday. They were going to this holiday town or village. And when they arrived there, they went to the caretaker's house. It was during the day, I believe, and my father knocked on the door. It was opened by a lady by the name of Helena, and she had known my father for many years. She'd known him since he was a small child. She'd looked after him when the family were around. She was actually very close to the family. He adored her, and she looked after him whenever he was up there over many years. So when they opened the door, there she was on her own. They asked her if they could stay for a few days while they worked out where they'd go next or what they could do to stay alive, basically. She welcomed them in. She said, yes, of course you can stay, but I can't keep you in the house. You can't be in the other house. You'll have to be in the attic. Why did they need to be in the attic? Because, and we found this out much later, many years later, 50 years later.
Was that on your trip?
When we went there, this is when we found out what was in her mind and her conversations and what she did, because we didn't have this from our parents. What we had from our parents were that there was a caretaker called Alexander, and they lived in a house in a street where my mother didn't remember the name, but it was about 20 minutes from the railway station. They were the clues we had. So she said, yes, you can stay, but you'll have to be in the attic on the top of my house, the caretaker's house. And there they were. They expected to stay for a few days. She told us later, when we went in 1997, that she never told her husband that they were there because he was a drinker, and she told us through an interpreter that he also had a loose tongue. And he worked in a nearby hospital, which was only about 100 metres from the house. It was a hospital, it had been a hospital, but at this time it had been commandeered and it was being used by guards who worked in a concentration camp in the next village, which was called Otvotsk. There was a concentration camp. The guards were living in this hospital where her husband worked with his long tongue and his drinking habit. So she couldn't tell him. For this, not the same reason, but with the similar sort of idea, she couldn't tell her children because they went to school. They could have just said something and it would be the end for the family if it was found out that they were keeping Jews in their attic, in their house. So they stayed there, not just for a few days, but in the end they were there for 14 months, over 400 days. And she would wake and get up at about 4:30 each morning. She would stoke up the wood fire in their house, their cottage, and make a big pot of soup for the family to last them the whole day. She'd make a little bit extra that they didn't appear to notice, and she'd send a bowl of this soup in a bucket, and I'm not sure how she did it, whether it was a rope or climbing stairs or how it happened, but she sent a bucket with a bowl in it up to the two people in the attic, and they would use the same bucket as a toilet. She would take the bucket back at some time and repeat the process every day for over a year and a couple of months. They soon found that bowl of soup was not enough to sustain them, so my mother had a fake ID. I don't know how she got it, where she got it, how long she had it, but we've got it. Fortunately for them, she had blonde hair and blue eyes, and she had a fake name, and her ID had no indication that she was Jewish, this new ID, and a similar date of birth to her own, I think same day, same year, but a different month, and a different surname. Her first name was the same, Vanda.
So was this ID made specifically for her, or was it someone else's?
I don't know the answer to that. I've always thought that it was made for her.
Okay.
Because she used to go, as I was saying, the bowl of soup wasn't enough for them. So she used to go to the station, go by train to Warsaw, meet some friends, supporters of theirs, who would give her a heap of vegetables, which she'd have in a bag. I don't know if she had a backpack or handbag or whatever, but she'd take a big bag of vegetables back with her, and that would supplement the bowl of soup that Helena gave them. They also found that they couldn't just stay in this attic, a little prison, because the muscles were just atrophying. So they'd both go down in the middle of the night and walk up and down the road. And it was a very small village, there were very few people. It was mainly holiday houses, so it was reasonably safe at that time in the middle of the night to go out and have some exercise. Now they stayed in that attic, as I said, for about 14 months until Helena told them that the Russian military were coming, and at that time they were on the same side as the Allies. They were coming from the east, and they were defeating the Nazis, and it was safe to come out. She took them to the road. A truck with Russian soldiers in it came by, picked them up, took them to a hospital in another city in Lublin, where they recuperated. They were there for a few months, and then they went to Lodz, or Łódź, which was then probably the largest city in Poland, surviving, and there were people there who were trying to set up a new government, and that's where they thought they'd establish themselves and rebuild their life. And I was born in Lodz in 1946, and not that long after I was born, later in that year or early the following year, became obvious to them that Poland was not the place for them to stay because there were still pogroms going on. The war was over. This was 1946 into 47. Poles were still killing Jews. It wasn't the Nazis this time, it was Poles.
What do you take away from this legacy? This podcast is called Their Stories Unbroken, and it's about the idea that the legacy of your parents and that in your family lives on today. What are the things that you've taken in your life and maybe reflections today that you think about with this story that was almost broken but wasn't?
What I take away is resilience. Whatever happened, there's always tomorrow. My father wasn't admitted to the university in Poland the first time round. He got in next time. He was knocked back at the university when he came in Melbourne. It took him 10 years, but he ended up getting in there. So persistence in the right sort of directions, I guess, pays off. And I think that's probably something that we tell our children, our grandchildren, that you don't look back, you look forward. But I have to say, he couldn't have done it without my mother and her support and what she did. And there are those little incidents like she had, whether it was jewellery or a fur coat, bribed the guard. She was the one that went and got them some more food to keep them going with her fake ID. And when he was a student, even though they'd had a business and had saved a bit of money in investment, she was working after that. And my brother was born in 1956. In those days you didn't have parental leave and things like that. I remember he was born and she was back at work, I think, within days, putting him in childcare before very long. And I remember that part of things because when I was a teenager, he was growing up as a small child, and because my parents were both working or studying, but working, they were away from home in the evening after my school finished, and it was my job to pick him up and bring him home. As he was a child, I was a teenager, so they had a built-in babysitter.
Yeah.
The evidence is there, right here, right here. You have my daughter, my grandchildren. If not for my parents and us and my daughter, you wouldn't have the principal you have here today.
Yeah, that's
he
right.
wouldn't be here. That's an aside. But,
but it is amazing. No, that's why we wanted to have you as our first guest on this podcast, Stephen, because obviously the connection within the school and the school context, but also, the amazing life and contribution you've made, and that legacy lives on with your wonderful family. So thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for, as they say, having me.
No worries. Their Stories Unbroken is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the founders of the Bialik community, who in 1942, a time of tragedy and horror for the Jewish people, and for so many others around the world, visioned and developed Bialik College as a new type of schooling for the youngest members of the Jewish community. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe, follow, review and share. If you would like to get in touch with me, you can email theirstoriesunbroken@gmail.com. Thank you to Bialik College and all the staff behind the scenes that have helped make Their Stories Unbroken possible. I'd also like to offer a special thank you to the Bialik College Parents Association for their support in the podcast, as well as to musician Adam Starr. Additional thanks to Yad Vashem and the Gandalf Foundation. Please check out the show notes for links and any additional information. See you next time.